Welcome to Tanakh Talk. I'm your host, William Hall, broadcasting live from Kingsland, Texas, USA, with another episode of A Rabbi Cross-Examines the New Testament with Rabbi Michael Skobac. Almost said Michael Skobac from Canada. Today's special show being a combination of two chapters from two different letters, Colossians 4 and 1 Thessalonians 1. All right, Rabbi, are you ready to kick this thing off?
Well, this is not in honor of Mother's Day, but
good to know.
Yeah, Paul basically almost drove me to drink because we were supposed to do Colossians chapter 4 tonight and finish out the letter, the book of Colossians, but he basically, I don't know if he intended to do this to Rabbi Skobac, but he basically bored me to death. And I think the show would have been 5 minutes. So
right, that's funny.
I was forced to say, okay, maybe we'll do 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, but the truth is it's not much better because basically what you have at the end of Colossians is Paul kissing everybody goodbye, and not much more than that. And in 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, he's basically, a very short chapter, he's saying hi to everybody. So,
right, gotcha.
So we'll try to share a few thoughts on these two chapters. And then, of course, next week, chapter 2 of Thessalonians is actually action-packed.
Oh, good.
So
cool.
We never hit this before, but I guess it's inevitable that you're going to get two clunkers in a row, and we definitely hit that tonight. So in the beginning of chapter 4 of Colossians, Paul asks that his readers pray for him. And in the world of Christianity, especially among evangelical Christians, prayer is a very central focus of their lives. People tend to put a lot of emphasis on their prayer life. And what I've heard over the years among some Christians is that they tend to look down upon or knock Jewish liturgical prayer. I often hear this criticism that, yeah, you guys, read your prayers out of a book, but we actually talk to God. And I want to just spend a few moments addressing this idea, which again is not necessarily coming from all Christians, but I've heard it enough times to suspect that many people feel this way. So first of all, when we look at the Jewish prayer book, we should realize that a tremendous amount of it is basically from the book of Psalms. So I don't see how anyone could knock, using the Psalms as a focus for prayer. David's Psalms, David's songs are, in a sense, in the history of humankind, the ultimate prayer. Here was a person whose heart was on fire for God, and he experienced every possible kind of emotion, and he expresses himself so beautifully that we try to piggyback with him in terms of using his prayers as a springboard for our prayers as well. Another part of the prayer book is actually from the Torah itself, from the 5 books of Moses itself. So, for example, there is a biblical commandment from the 5 books of Moses, from the Torah, to recite the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And so in a Jewish prayer book, that's done twice a day. And there are actually 3 paragraphs from the Torah, from the 5 books of Moses. The central Jewish prayer is called a number of names for it. It's sometimes called the Amida, which means the standing prayer because it said standing. It's sometimes called the Shmona Esrei, which means the 18, because it originally had 18 blessings. Now it has 19 blessings, but the original name stuck. And that you won't find in the Bible. However, we know that the Shemona Esrei was composed by the Anshe Knesset Hagadola, the men of the Great Assembly, who basically were the leaders of the Jewish community around 2,400 years ago. And this assembly of 120 sages and teachers and scholars included quite a few prophets. Prophets like Malachi and Zechariah and Haggai, among others. And so what we're praying, the words that we're praying, are not just, our words. These are words that actually we were instructed to pray by God's prophets. And actually, anyone that is truly interested in being obedient to God should think about obeying what the prophet said that we should say. Now, that's the liturgical part of Jewish prayer, meaning the liturgical part of Jewish prayer is basically all coming from either the Bible or composed by people that included prophets. The second thing to realize is that there is non-liturgical Jewish prayer, and many, many, many Jewish people spend a significant amount of time every day just speaking to God in their own words, praising God for who He is, thanking God for what we have, asking God for what we need. This is called, and let's say among the followers of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, this is called hit bodedut, from the word hit boded, which means to be, to be set aside and to be private, to set yourself aside from other people and to have a private audience with God and to speak to God in your own language. And there are people who do this throughout the day. So there are people who might spend 15 minutes, a half hour, an hour, sometimes even more, having this kind of personal conversation and prayer session with God. And many people will have many sessions during the day, many of them. Anyone who watched Fiddler on the Roof will know that Tovia was someone who prayed throughout the day for every little thing that came up. So I think that, Christians who, I think inappropriately critique Jewish prayer should first learn a little bit more about what it means when Jewish people pray and what Jewish prayer is all about. Going on in the chapter to verse 5, Paul writes here, and again, I mentioned previously that there's a whole discussion among scholars whether Paul actually wrote this or this is just attributed to Paul. But in verse 5 in chapter 4, Paul writes, "Be wise in the way you act towards outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity." And the vast majority of commentaries explain this to mean that believers in Jesus, Christians, should live their life in a way that establishes the credibility of the Christian faith. Many Christians today call this friendship evangelism or lifestyle evangelism, but that's what Paul seems to be saying here, that you should, in your daily life, use every opportunity and every interaction in a way that will effectively communicate the gospel. And the problem here, should be an obvious problem, is that no smile and no act of kindness or no friendship can ever establish the credibility of any faith. Again, the commentaries say that Christians should live in a way, they should live their life in a way that establishes the credibility of the Christian faith, but that's impossible. You can't establish the credibility of a faith by being nice, because the truth is that every religion on the face of the earth has adherents who are charismatic and who live exemplary lives, but that doesn't prove that what they believe is true. it either proves that these happen to be nice people, or maybe they're not nice people, but they're trying to be nice in order to sell their faith. And so I'm not knocking, people that are nice, but I think that it's just naive to think that, that being a good testimony in terms of the way someone lives their life really is able to establish the truth of what someone believes. And yet, it's interesting when you read the testimony of so many people who embraced Christianity. That's often what they speak about, how impressed they were with the quality of the lives of the Christians they met. Now, it's wonderful that that Christians or any people live exemplary lives. But again, it doesn't prove that what they believe is true. Moving on to verse 10, it's interesting that they refer here in verse 10 to a previous conflict, a rift between Paul and Barnabas and John, or John Mark sometimes is called. And this goes back to the book of Acts, initially in chapter 13, verse 13, where Paul wanted John to accompany him on a journey, and John basically didn't. John, essentially abandoned Paul, and didn't abandon him, but he didn't go with Paul. He went elsewhere. And apparently this stuck in Paul's craw, because later on in Acts chapter 15, verses 37 to 40, we see that Barnabas suggests to Paul that John Mark go with them on their next journey, and Paul doesn't want to. Paul says, look, this John Mark abandoned me. He left me high and dry, and so I don't want to go with him. And so what you see in that chapter in Acts 15 is that Barnabas and John go their way and Paul goes his way. And now you see at the end of Colossians chapter 4 that, this John Mark seems to be back in Paul's life. And so the Reformation Study Bible says the following on this verse. It says, "This rift finally healed. This testifies to the power of the reconciling work of the Messiah." And again, this is similarly naive to what we saw back in verse 5, meaning in the same way that the fact that someone is friendly and kind does not prove that what they believe is true. It's also naive to think that it's only Christians who are able to reconcile after they have a spat. I mean, the truth is that if you find people from every religious group in the world, and even people that are not religious, even atheists, they're perfectly able to reconcile after they have a fight or an argument. And so this is, the kind of, I find, self-serving but naive comment that really leaves me with a big question mark. Like, what were they thinking when the Reformation Study Bible put this comment in there? As if only Christians are able to reconcile their differences because of the reconciling work of the Messiah. Okay, on to verse 11. So Paul, as he's basically taking leave of everyone at the end of this chapter, he mentions a number of people. And in verse 11, he mentions Aristarchus and Mark, who is the cousin of Barnabas, and Jesus, who is also called Justice. And he refers to them as men of the circumcision. The other people that Paul mentions at the end of this chapter happen to not be Jewish. But here he's mentioning 3 Jews, but he refers to them as men of the circumcision. And I found that this is a strange way of designating them as Jews, a strange appellation. He just could have said they were Hebrews or they were Jews. children of Israel. There's so many ways that he could have described them and referred to them, because Paul usually identified his enemies as those of the circumcision, meaning that he would speak about the circumcision party or those of the circumcision, because he had these people that were following him around, insisting that Gentiles had to get circumcised and follow the entire Torah in order to really have a connection to Jesus. So he would often use this term of the circumcision in a very derisive kind of way. And for some strange reason, this is the way he refers to these people in his group. So I thought that was a little bit odd. And finally, the last observation I wanted to make about this chapter is that in verse 18, it becomes very clear to me that this entire chapter, actually, it becomes clear when you actually just read the chapter, the whole chapter. It's quite clear that this letter to the Colossians is a private pastoral letter from Paul to his church. And it's obviously not a prophecy or a prophetic communication coming from God. Paul never says that, God spoke to him these words. Paul never gives any kind of indication that this is divine revelation. We've mentioned many times before that actually nowhere in the Christian Bible do you ever have the kind of formula that you find throughout the Tanakh, like, thus says the Lord, or the word of the Lord came to me, or, things like that, where the text actually tells you that it's a communication from God, that it's prophecy. But when you read this fourth chapter, it's just very obvious that this is Paul writing his own personal letter to the Colossian church. He ends in verse 18, he says, this salutation is by my own hand, meaning usually Paul had a scribe that he would dictate the letters to a scribe. And now Paul takes over the last verse in the book, in the letter, and he says, this salutation, meaning this goodbye, is by my own hand. I'm writing this myself, Paul says. Remember my chains, grace be with you. And throughout the letter, he keeps on saying, for example, in verse 3, that it's his letter, and just the sense and the content of this last chapter make it very clear that the whole letter is basically his letter. It's a letter that Paul has written, to his audience and to the Colossian community, and there's just not even a pretense that this is divine revelation. And that's basically, all I really had to share for this concluding chapter in Colossians. And so I decided that because it was going to be pretty short, that we will start 1 Thessalonians chapter 1. It's interesting that when scholars try to date these books and when they were written, many scholars believe that 1 Thessalonians was actually one of the earliest documents in the Greek scriptures. Some think that Galatians might have been the first thing that Paul wrote. Some people believe that 1 Thessalonians was the first thing that Paul wrote. Many believe 1 Thessalonians was the second thing that was written by Paul, but it's pretty early, according to most commentaries. And we'll get into this actually as we study this letter of 1 Thessalonians. But it's very interesting in terms of the timing, because most people seem to date this letter to around the year 50 of the Common Era. And one of the themes that will come up in this letter quite a bit is the supposed second coming of Jesus. Now, it's interesting why this would be such an important theme in this letter. And I think that if you go back to the Gospels, Jesus allegedly says at one point that this generation will not pass away till all will be fulfilled. And so we know from the Gospels themselves that none of the followers of Jesus expected him to be killed. That was something that was totally unexpected. Even though there are passages in the Gospels where Jesus allegedly predicts his death, I don't know if I really believe he did that. I think it's quite possible that those passages were put into his mouth afterwards. And if he did predict his death, it's interesting that when he finally does die, it still shocks all of his followers. That seems to be a little bit more evidence that he never told them that he's supposed to be killed, when he comes to Jerusalem. So it's very clear that they were shocked, totally shocked and disheartened by his death. And, because it's clear from the Christian Bible itself that they were expecting Jesus to fulfill the biblical template, the biblical picture of what the Messiah was supposed to accomplish. For example, in the first chapter of Acts, chapter 1 and verse 6, I believe, when the alleged resurrection of Jesus takes place, the first thing that his disciples ask him is, will you restore the kingdom to Israel at this time? I mean, that's exactly what they were expecting, that if he's the Messiah, where's the beef? Where's the world peace? Where is the, where are we going to have the Roman idolaters kicked out of Israel and we're going to rule the land? And it's very clear that that's what the apostles were expecting. And it didn't happen. And even after his alleged resurrection, he doesn't do anything. I mean, he comes back to life, and then he shortly after goes up to heaven. But nothing really happens. The world is the same messed up, broken world it was during the life of Jesus. And so there you have now the development of the doctrine of the second coming, the idea that Jesus will come back one day, and he will make everything right, and he will fulfill all of the prophecies that he was supposed to fulfill the first time around. And so the question is, when is he going to return? So you have, a number of passages in the Gospels where he seems to be saying, in one story he says, the people he's speaking to, you will not taste death until you see the Son of Man returning in his kingdom. And in his kingdom means, right, the restoring of the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of God. And in another passage, as I mentioned, he says, this generation will not pass away till everything be fulfilled. So it was very clear that the earliest Christians expected Jesus to return within that generation. Now, generation is approximately 25 years or so. And so if Jesus is killed around the year 30, 31, 32, we don't even know exactly when he was executed, but around the time that First Thessalonians is being written is approximately one generation later. And probably Christians were now looking at their watches and wondering, so what's going on? He's supposed to be back already. And so one of the things that Paul will speak about in this letter is this topic of the second coming of Jesus, because obviously it's something that people are discussing, people are wondering. It becomes a water cooler conversation for sure. Now, the only verse I really wanted to look at in this chapter, 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, is verse 3. Where Paul basically says that the Thessalonians were pagans who turned away from idols. And now he congratulates them that they now have been turned toward the living God. And so this is, Paul takes a lot of pride in the Thessalonians. He describes them as people who were, primitive pagans who probably worshiped, basically just statues, or just animals or whatever they worshiped. And, he believes that, there's been a tremendous improvement because they've turned from idols and they've now embraced the living God. And so the question that I wanted to consider is whether or not this is actually the case. Meaning, is Christianity a legitimate faith in the Almighty, or is Christianity idolatry? And I will preface my remarks by saying that this is an incredibly technical discussion in Jewish law. And, people shouldn't think that, anyone that has not really studied the basics of Jewish law, like master the basic contents of the Talmud, for example, that they can necessarily easily understand technical rabbinic discussions of Jewish law. They're actually quite complex because it's not just understanding the Tanakh, but understanding the contents of the Talmud, and then understanding all the commentaries to the Talmud. So in rabbinic thought, these become very technical, complex discussions. And so we're not going to be able to really plumb the depths of this topic tonight, but I just wanted to make a few basic observations. So again, the question that we wanted to just think about is Christianity idolatry? Meaning, when Paul here is congratulating the Thessalonians for graduating from idol worship to a legitimate form of worship of God, is that really the case? So I would say the following as an introduction. The Torah, basically, we have to remember, is a document that was a message from God, but the audience, meaning that who was God speaking to in the Torah, it's important to understand that God is speaking and he identifies the audience. The audience, the listeners to God, are the children of Israel. Throughout the 5 books of Moses, this is clear, right? God spoke to the children of Israel, or God spoke to Moses and said to Moses, say to the children of Israel. Everything is directed to Israel. And throughout the Bible, God makes that very clear. He's speaking to those who he redeemed from Egypt. And it's never in the Bible is it said that God is speaking to the world at large. The Torah, the 5 books of Moses, are not God's message to humanity. It's God's message to the Israelites, to the children of Israel. And this is very important because I believe that many people just don't realize this. They assume that the Torah is God speaking directly to them. Now, I'm not discounting that there may be a message in the Torah for people who are not the children of Israel. There very clearly is, but we have to know how to discern where that message is. And you find, for example, that David says in the book of Psalms at the end of chapter 147, he makes this distinction that God revealed his Torah and his laws to the people of Israel and not to the nations of the world. So when we go to the 20th chapter of Exodus, where you have the what we call the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 sayings, the 10 statements, sometimes inaccurately translated as the 10 commandments. There aren't 10 commandments. The Torah has hundreds of commandments. But there obviously were 10 special directives that were written on these tablets. And the first one is a statement of the existence of God. And commentaries are puzzled. It's not expressed in the form of a commandment. It's just God says, I am the Lord your God, who took you out of the land of Egypt from the house of slavery. Again, very clearly addressing the people of Israel. And then in the second and third commandments, God goes on to prohibit any kind of idolatry, anything, worshiping anything other than God, worshiping any other God or worshiping any image of God. That's basically what you find in the book of Exodus. And then when you go to the book of Deuteronomy, the Bible further defines what this means when we speak about idolatry. It's very important to study the 4th and 5th chapters of Deuteronomy. And what you see there is that God reminds the Jewish people about their experience at Mount Sinai. And God says in chapter 4, verse 35, that I showed you, that you were shown, God says, I showed to you who I am. It was revealed to you. The word in Hebrew actually is to show. I made you see. Ata har'eta, lir'ot is the Hebrew word to see. So basically you were shown, you were made to see, God says, that I am the Lord and there is no other. And the question is, how did God demonstrate who he was? Where did God demonstrate who he was? And so it's clear from the context that this is referring to the experience of the Jewish people in the Exodus from Egypt, and more pointedly, at the revelation of God at Mount Sinai, meaning when God revealed himself to the Jewish people at Mount Sinai, that was God's revelation of who he was. And what the book of Deuteronomy repeats over and over again is that idolatry is defined by any concept, the worship of anything that your fathers did not experience, that you did not experience at Mount Sinai, meaning that whatever was not shown to you at Mount Sinai is considered idolatry. And so if we just recognize that at Mount Sinai there was not one Jew who stood there who told his children or her children that God was revealed to them at Sinai as a Trinity, or in the form of a human being, or in any form. Because again, in that chapter, God repeats twice that nothing was seen. You didn't see anything when I spoke to you from the mountain. So God did not reveal himself to them as having any physical form, and therefore to worship any kind of physical manifestation of God is considered idolatry. And so this becomes the biblical definition of idolatry, the worship of anything or anyone or any deity that our fathers and ancestors did not experience at Mount Sinai. And if you go to the 13th chapter of Deuteronomy, it repeats this idea at least 4 or 5 times. A God that you did not know, a God that your fathers did not know. This becomes the biblical criteria. This is the experience that God transmitted. It's interesting that God is not saying that, you should stay away from gods that you didn't read about in the Bible. God is saying, I gave you an experience, and your experience is your guide. What you did not experience at Mount Sinai is idolatry. So what we have, interestingly, if we go back to the 10 Commandments, is a verse which is often not really well understood. In Exodus chapter 20, verse 3, God says, Lo yihya lecha Elohim acherim al panai. Literally, there shall not be to you other gods, literally, upon my face, on my face. Or probably colloquially you'd say, in my presence, meaning you shall not have other gods in my presence. And what does that mean? You should not have other gods in my presence. So one of the great Jewish sages, writing about 1100 years ago approximately, Rav Sajagon writes, Mikan Asra Torah Shituf, that from here you see that the Torah prohibits Shituf. Shituf literally means partnership, meaning God is saying, you may not have any other gods in my presence, meaning even if you are worshiping me, but if you include in that worship something else, meaning me plus something else, that's called shituf, that's called partnership, meaning you're partnering God with something else. That's prohibited in this passage in Exodus, where God says, you shall not have any other gods on my face, in my presence. And so we see this concept repeated a few chapters later in Exodus chapter 22, verse 19. There it says, one who brings offerings to the gods shall be destroyed. Only to Hashem alone, only to God alone. If you bring offerings to the gods, you will be punished severely. You may only bring offerings to God alone. God alone. And the commentary of Avadia Soforno, Italian Bible commentary from he was born in 1470, he died in 1550, I believe. So he explains what this means is that even if you include in your offerings, meaning that you're bringing these offerings to other gods, but even if you include and you have intention that you want the sacrifices to be directed to the Almighty, to Hashem as well, this is prohibited. Meaning that God says, no, you can only bring offerings to me alone. And if you're bringing sacrifices to me and to other entities, to other gods, or other beings, along with me, that is prohibited in this verse as well. Exodus 22, verse 19. God says, no, you are only to bring sacrifices to me alone. And if you bring them to me plus other beings, that is prohibited by this, again, prohibition we saw in Exodus chapter 20, verse 3, the prohibition against having any other gods in the presence of God. Meaning that even if you are worshiping God, even if your focus is on the creator of heavens and earth, if you include anything else in addition, that's called shituf, partnership, and it's prohibited. And this is what Elijah the prophet basically is screaming about in 1 Kings chapter 17, verse 21, where he says to the Jews who are basically worshiping God and Baal, they're doing both. He says, how long will you dance between two opinions? If Hashem is the God, go after him. And if the Baal, go after it. But you can't combine them. You can't combine them. Now, the question is Christianity idolatry? So I have to say very, very clearly that according to 100% of Torah sages and Torah authorities, without exception, Christianity would be idolatry for any Jew. For any Jew to worship the Trinity, to pray to Jesus, to believe that Jesus is God, and to worship him, is basically a violation of shituf. Again, the Jews at Mount Sinai were warned that they may not add anything onto their worship of the Creator. Now, Christians will insist that Jesus is the creator. That doesn't change the reality. They may claim that, they may insist that. There's an old story that, very famous story about Abraham Lincoln, that he was once dealing with someone in a courtroom and said, if you took a jackal and you called its tail a leg, how many legs would it have? And the fellow said it would have 5 legs. And Lincoln said, no, it would only have 4 legs. Just because you call a tail a leg doesn't mean it's a leg. So Christians can scream from today until next year that Jesus is the creator of the world and Jesus is God. That doesn't make him God. And it's very clear that Jesus is a created being. Christians may not believe that, but that's pretty clear. And Jesus breathes the same air that any of us breathe. And, Jesus is physical, like we are all physical. And we know that God cannot be physical. The Bible tells us at least 3 times that God is not a man. We've discussed this many times in the past. The Bible makes it very clear the Messiah will not be God. The Messiah will be a human being who will fear God. So for a Jew to worship Jesus as God would be absolutely idolatrous. However, I mentioned before that the Bible is not directed to all of mankind necessarily. And when God prohibits shituf, partnership, in Exodus chapter 20, that's obviously directed to Jews. Because again, if you start off in chapter 20, it's very clear that the whole chapter, God is speaking to the Jewish people standing at Mount Sinai. But what about the rest of the world? So I wanted to spend just a few minutes just introducing this topic. It's a very, again, I mentioned complicated and technical, but I'll share a few ideas. First of all, the doctrine of the Trinity seems very clearly to fall into this category of shituf, of partnership. The worship of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. God the Father is worshipped alongside Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus of Nazareth is not just seen as the Son of God, but God the Son. Now, we should make it clear that not all Christians embrace the doctrine of the Trinity. The J Witnesses do not, Christadelphians do not, some Unitarians do not, some very liberal Protestant denominations do not. However, Roman Catholics and Orthodox Christians, evangelical Protestants, and most liberal Protestant denominations all worship the Trinity. So how are we to understand this prohibition as it applies to non-Jews? So the Talmud has a law. The Talmud says that a Jew should not become a business partner with an idolater. If someone's an idolater, a Jew should not become a business partner with them, because the Talmud says that you may get into a dispute, and the person that you're disputing with, your partner, may end up having to take an oath in court, and they may end up swearing in the name of their idolatry. There is a prohibition in the Bible, in Exodus chapter 23, verse 13, that you're forbidden to mention the name of idolatry. You shouldn't even mention the name of something that's idolatry, and you shouldn't cause it to be mentioned. You shouldn't even cause someone to mention the name of idolatry. And so the concern in the Talmud is that if you have a business relationship, a partner with an idolater, and you get into a dispute, the idolater may end up in court swearing in the name of their idolatry. And that's a big problem, because you're not supposed to cause anyone to even mention the name of their idol. So one of the commentaries on the Talmud, referred to as Tosfos, says that today this is not forbidden. It's not applicable today, in his day, because again, you have to realize that he was living in Europe where, the only people that he knew of that were not Jewish were Christians. So he says that this prohibition, it was not applicable in his day. And again, he's writing now in approximately the 13th century, the 12th to 13th century. He says because the idolaters, when they swear in court, they're not swearing, he says, to idols. He says only to their saints. And when they speak of God, he says it's only of the Creator. That's the opinion of someone named Rabbeinu Tam. Now, if you ask Rabbeinu Tam, what about the prohibition of swearing in the name of God plus? Meaning, isn't there a prohibition of making an oath in the name of God plus the name of something else? Isn't that a problem? And so this sage, Rabbeinu Tam, says that no. He says, Noachides, B'nai Noach, meaning non-Jews, are not forbidden in this. They're not prohibited from swearing in the name of God plus something else. This is accepted by some people as Torah law. However, there is a commentary by the Noda B'Yehuda, who was an 18th century sage from Prague. Back then it was, I guess, Czechoslovakia, but whatever country Prague was in back then. His name was Rabbi Yecheskel Landau. He says that there are people who make this claim that non-Jews are not prohibited in shituf, that they're not prohibited in this idea of partnership. But he insists that there actually is no such view. And he points out that Maimonides, in his massive code of Jewish law, never mentions this idea that for non-Jews, shituf, partnership, is okay. As a matter of fact, Maimonides very, very specifically says that Christianity is idol worship. It is idolatry. Now, the question comes up for the Noda B'Yehuda, for this Rabbi Yecheskel Landau, what about the opinion of Rabbeinu Tam that we mentioned before, who says that non-Jews are able to worship shituf, are able to swear in the name of God plus something else? So he says that Rabbeinu Tam never meant that non-Jews can worship something other than God. He only says that when they're taking oaths, his comment is only regarding taking oaths, that they can mention something else other than God when they're taking oaths. But to worship, to pray to something other than God would be idolatry even for non-Jews. And this is, again, widely discussed among the Jewish sages. And at the end of the day, what you have is, over the centuries, a dispute, a debate among Jewish sages. The majority of Jewish sages seem to take the view that even for non-Jews, Christianity, the worship of Jesus, would be idolatry. There are some views who seem to maintain, possibly, that it may not be a violation of idolatry for non-Jews. Now, I would just want to end tonight by asking one or two questions about this lenient, this more permissive view. And again, I'm not going to, this is a long-standing technical debate in Jewish law, but I just wanted to raise two questions of my own when it comes to this permissive view. Number one, in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 19, it says the following to the Jewish people: "Lest you raise your eyes to the heavens, and you see the sun and the moon and the stars, the entire legion of heaven, and you be drawn astray, and you bow to them and worship them, which Hashem your God has apportioned to all the nations under the entire heaven. So here in this verse, it seems to be saying that God has allowed the nations of the world to somehow worship the constellations, the stars, and the heavens. That would again seem to support the permissive view. However, what I would wonder is the following, that perhaps God would allow shituf, this idea of partnership, when non-Jews worship him along with the constellations in the heavens, because we know that these constellations represent angelic powers, and we know that God's supervision, God's we call it in Hebrew hashgacha, his supervision, his providence over the nations of the world come through these constellations, through these heavenly forces, these angelic forces. And so perhaps you could say that shituf would be acceptable, perhaps, for someone that's not Jewish to worship God, plus the constellations that God has set up, the angelic forces, the heavenly forces that God has set up to basically exercise providence over the nations of the world. But for the nations of the world to worship God and a human being, meaning that if we talk about partnership, we would have to say that the partner has to be someone worthy of being a partner with God. So you might say that, okay, God and the angelic realm, or the realm of the heavenly spheres that God has appointed to be the spiritual source of his providence over the nations of the world, maybe you can see that as a partnership. But to have God with some first century Jewish man that was killed, he becomes God's partner, that's very hard to understand. So I think this is a question that we could ask about shituf. And the other problem is this, that the whole concept of shituf, of partnership, works. The whole concept is when we're speaking about God plus some subordinate power, meaning that what seems to be, again, permitted by some authorities is the worship of the Almighty plus, in addition to the Almighty, some subordinate power like the stars or the sun or an angel. The problem is that most Trinitarians don't see Jesus as subordinate to God. They see him as co-equal and co-eternal, meaning here it's not really so much in terms of what Christians believe and what they worship. It's not so much that they even have a concept of shituf. They don't really see themselves as worshiping God plus something subordinate to God. They basically have elevated Jesus to the level of God. And that probably doesn't really even fit into this permissible category called shituf. So I think that there may be some problems for the permissible, lenient view, and we'll leave it at that because we're not going to really bring this ship to its docking position tonight. This has been discussed by sages for centuries, but just some food for thought. And God willing, next Sunday we will begin chapter 2 of 1 Thessalonians, and I think we'll have much more meat to bite into then.
That sounds like a plan, Rabbi. Oh, I think I just heard myself. I don't know why. That is okay. Well, cool. Well, it was definitely it's always good to end one of those letters, especially whenever it's running kind of slow. So next week, I guess it's going to be a little bit more of a popper. Not to be confused with the cheddar pepper popper or whatever you call it. My wife loves those, by the way. So, well, Rabbi, thank you for your time. It's been a good show, and we'll look forward to seeing you same time, same place next week. So, yeah, much appreciated. Guys, thanks for tuning in. We'll see you also. Feel free to subscribe to the YouTube channel, turn on notifications so you know when we go live. And some of you don't know this, but we got some new little hats in. So if you're interested in that, there's some information in the video description below. Very cool. So thank you guys. We'll see you next time. Shalom, shalom.
חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד. איפוק זו העוצמה, ויתור זו הגדולה, השאיפה